Azgrod's going to be defending that the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent, and Koco is going to be taking the opposition. Just a normal back and forth debate, no moderation or set time limit, and at the end we'll put a voting poll at the end of the debate for the audience that was here for at least 75% of the debate to vote. And yeah, I believe Azgrod's taken the affirmative, so if you want to open up Azgrod, you can go for it.
Okay. So I am defending the proposition that the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent. There's a few terms that we may need to agree upon. Otherwise, our disagreement is going to be semantic rather than substantive. But if that's the case, then I accept it. So by the Christian God, I mean that being which meets all of the kind of predicates that are described in the Christian Bible about the God that they speak of, or their Lord. So if there is a passage in the Bible which says something of the form, God is jealous, or God is incomprehensible, or some such thing, each of those claims within the Bible constitutes the definition of God, such that, like, God is a being which is jealous and incomprehensible, and this, and so on and so forth. That's the definition of the Christian God that I'm using. Then, when I say almost certainly, this is a qualifier. I'm not saying that God certainly does not exist. I'm not saying that God is internally contradictory, or that God is contradictory to what we know in about reality. This may be the case, but that's not the stance that I'm taking for this argument. What I'm claiming is that it is highly unlikely for this Christian God to exist. And to argue this, I use probability theory. Me and Koco had a pretty similar discussion earlier. I think I'm gonna be repeating a lot of the same arguments, but the
We're 3 for 3 on probability being a part of our discussions.
yeah. So the starting point for any, determination of the probability of a proposition is to determine its prior probability, which is the probability that we assign to the proposition without taking into account any evidence for or against the proposition. And this prior probability is determined entirely by the complexity of the proposition. And to determine the complexity, we look at how many propositions is this proposition a compound of? What are all the individual atomic propositions that make up this compound proposition? So for God, what we're saying is something of the form, God is a being that X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and so on. So it's kind of like God is something with the following predicates, and then you list a shitload of predicates. And to turn this into a more logical framework, we say that, like, this proposition is this definition of God, or this claim that this God exists is a conjunction of a whole bunch of claims, each one saying that there is a God, there is a thing that exists, there is a thing that exists that has the, the Christian God has this this attribute, and the Christian God has this attribute, and the Christian God has this attribute, and so on and so forth. And for each of those claims, those atomic propositions can be either true or false, independently of one another. So let's say that there's like 20 independent claims in this definition of God. Um, each of those claims could be true while all the others are false. Each of them could be false while all the others are true. Um, and so to determine the complexity of this, you take essentially 2 to the power of the number of claims. That's the number of possibilities. That's the number of uh, uh, rows in the truth table, if you were to make such a truth table for this. And so that's and then the prior probability is derived from this complexity in the following way. The prior probability of the proposition is 1 divided by that complexity. So if there's let's say 20 Boolean variables involved in a proposition, then the prior probability of this proposition is 1 divided by 2 to the power of 20. With God, there are, I will show, at least 20 8 independent claims about the nature of God within the Bible, which constitute the definition of this God. And so the probability of God, the prior probability of God existing is at least, or is at most, right? It's at least as improbable as 1 divided by 2 to the power of 28, which is a very large, a very small probability. So it's far larger than a million. It's like something like 200 million or something. I haven't actually checked it, but I could in a second if we want. But it's definitely larger than 1 in a million chance. Or it's certainly less probable than 1 in a million. So this is the prior probability, and then of course this doesn't mean necessarily that the posterior probability of God is very small. I'm just saying the prior probability is small so far. Now, to determine what the posterior probability is, now we have to take into account all of the evidence for and against the existence of God. But I will leave this up to my interlocutor. I'm not going to argue on his behalf. I will simply establish the prior probability and then allow Koco here to make claims that are positive evidence for the existence of God, and I'll see if I agree with him that it changes the probability sufficiently to believe that God is not very unlikely.
You sure you don't want to argue on my behalf? I would love it.
Yeah, no, I'm all right.
I have an opening statement that I prepared too. It should be pretty quick, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it real quick, and then we'll get into the discussion. I will say, just for the sake of the kind of laying everything out, I wasn't aware that I was supposed to bring positive claims as far as like the evidence of God's existence. I actually do kind of want to take a little bit of a semantic issue with the way in which that you are defining God, but we'll get to that. Yeah, so I'll just read my opening statement real quick, and then we'll kind of launch into discussion there. It is the case that you can reasonably apply the usage of probability theory to the likelihood of nearly all things within the known and even sometimes the unknown universe. One particular instance where this methodology could be particularly useful is in the attempt to assign probability to the existence of God or specific gods. For the sake of our current discussion, we are attempting to ascribe these probabilistic methodologies to the existence of the Christian God through, based off of the previous debate that you had claims made by Scripture, and it sounds like in this debate as well, you are doing that through claims made by Scripture. And while I ultimately would likely come down on the side that the complexity necessary for the existence of a God through so many contingencies would necessarily make it so unlikely that we ought to say it may as well not exist, the threshold for proving the existence of a Christian God is in fact substantially lower than what it is my opponent would claim, or my interlocutor would claim, to be more generous. While it might be the case that statements in the Bible imply that a chain of conditions must be met in order for the God of the Bible to be assumed to be real, this is in fact not the case. For while there are certainly claims made about things that God did or things that God is, the validity of those claims is not a necessary condition for the existence of that particular God. This is the case because of a number of factors. Primarily that the proximity that we have to those claims and to the language of those claims make it nearly impossible for us to be certain that they are in fact claims that would imply a necessary truth in order for subsequent claims to follow. For example, the claims outlined in the creation narrative are most likely in fact not a set of claims, but a set of metaphoric language intended to exist in juxtaposition to other creation narratives. And therefore, the only claim necessary to prove any of them would be God created the systems by which all creation came into being. And separating out each individual one is simply taking a myopic view of the potential understanding of Scripture. A view, mind you, that is in fact less than 200 years old. And in a storied religion with such a complex past, I would have a hard time believing that this view ought to be held in high regard. And that is the view that each claim or each statement in the creation narrative is meant to be an individual claim. If we continue in this line of thought, it becomes abundantly clear that the statements made in the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament, where you are likely to see the largest density of these individual claims, you would quickly find out that we do not, in fact, have a reliable way by which to separate out the different stylistic choices, intentions, and meanings of the authors. as all of these languages, experiences, and our ability to empathize with the conditions of their existence historically have been lost, especially in the Christian tradition, due to lack of importance placed on the true practices of Judaism, which is an entirely different discussion in itself about anthropology and history, but we don't need to get into that. And then I want to say, lastly, the term Christian God requires only a couple of claims to be true in order to presume that God exists. The only conditions necessary for a Christian God to exist are that Jesus died for the sins of mankind and that it is through Jesus exclusively that we are able to achieve salvation. There are no other claims to the Christian God that would make it true or false unless you can disprove either of those. And that is something that is outlined in Scripture and is supported by the general Christian community. So to say specifically that the Christian God is the one that is statistically impossible is in itself not a statement that is really worthwhile. But that does not necessarily mean that to say that God is statistically improbable, or that maybe perhaps the Jewish God is statistically improbable, would be a better claim to make. But as far as the Christian God is concerned, the number of conditions that need to be met in order for that to be true are substantially small. And really, in my opinion, not entirely provable.
I see. Okay, do you want to enumerate for me again the independent claims that you think like are actually necessary about God in order for it to be the Christian God?
Yeah, so there objectively there are really only two claims made in Scripture, and they're both made by Jesus in order for the Christian God to be presumed to be correct. Because what we're looking at is the Christian faith. And while the Christian faith is based traditionally in Judaism, it is not the case that Judaism must be entirely true for the Christian faith to be true. There are only two things that need to be true in order for the Christian faith to be true, as outlined by the father of the Christian faith, Jesus. And that is that Jesus is the Son of God. Sorry, three claims. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus died for all of the sins of mankind, and that it is through Jesus exclusively that we can achieve salvation, or that believers can achieve salvation. So there's really only three claims that would need to be true.
So just writing these down.
Yeah, of course. Now, I will say, oftentimes the evidence to prove those claims does come from argumentation in the Old Testament, where they're saying that like Jesus meets the conditions of this prophecy from the Old Testament. But we can look through Scripture and find the parallels that could potentially be interpreted to say that those prophecies did in fact come true. And in fact, this is something that you'll hear quite frequently in Christian circles, that the likelihood of Jesus being able to fulfill all of the prophecies from the Old Testament is the likelihood that you would be able to have, or be able to find blonde Oreo in the state of Texas if you were to fill that state of Texas up with regular Oreos and then put one like blonde Oreo in there, and that it would be like 50 feet deep of Oreos. So it's like incredibly statistically unlikely, according to most Christian theologians, including those that are well acknowledged. But there is a reasonable body of evidence in theology that would suggest that Jesus did in fact fulfill those, at least as far as we as interpreters can determine. Now, a lot of Jewish people will say that that is not the case, and that's totally fine. But ultimately, they're really splitting hairs quite frequently, as are most people when it comes to religious discussions.
I see. So your definition of the Christian God is a being whose son is Jesus. And it sounds to me like within the definition of Jesus, you have a person who died for the sins of mankind and who is the only source of salvation. Correct?
Say the first one more time for me, please.
Like the definition of God that you're giving me, of the Christian God, is
Mhm.
a being whose son is Jesus.
Yeah, I did say that. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay, so if there is, Joseph, for example, would be considered the Christian God.
Joseph, as in the husband of Mary.
Yeah. If he was in fact, like if in fact Jesus was born of Joseph and not like some omnipotent being, then you would define Joseph as God.
I do think that that's a little bit of like a not necessarily a very generous interpretation on your part, but I will say it's a good one. I definitely appreciate. When I say God, I am meaning like the prime mover, right?
Okay.
The thing that created everything, not specifically like some any random entity that happened to be the father of God, or sorry, the father of Jesus, and like Joseph was just running around claiming that it was God because he didn't want to get in trouble for fucking Mary because she was 15 and he was 31. Like
Jesus Christ. Okay.
this is born of unnatural circumstances. Don't stone me.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, and it's like I said, I feel like it's not quite as generous, but I appreciate it for sure.
Okay. So what I'm hearing now is that God is defined as a being who created everything and uh, whose son is Jesus. And then there's some other claims related to Jesus, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Will lightly commit to that. This is a debate after all, so I feel like I should be on my toes. Where's the
Okay.
gotcha?
So we'll see. So you're saying like anything that created everything and gave birth to Jesus would be considered God. So explain to me like when we say Jesus, like God's son is Jesus, what exactly are we saying there? Like what when you say son, I think impregnated a woman who gave
Yep.
birth to. Okay. So
Right.
God
Well, this is
like
where the issue of linguistic functions comes into play because, like, I think that there is a reasonable argument to be made that scripture is written in such a way that the linguistic faculties of the beings that would read it would be able to comprehend the intents and purposes behind the use of that specific kind of language. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the language within the Bible has like explicit or even implicit meaning that would align with our perception of those words if we were to get at the absolute truth of them, right? So it's not the case that Jesus is the son of God in that he is the genetic material perpetuated through the creation of the creation of a new successor, right? Through like
Mhm.
a biological function. It's just that the word son is used in the same way that the word father is used, right? God is not gendered. So God is not a father. Father is used as a method of associations that create a specific kind of view of God that attempts to ascribe or describe particular aspects of God to that God. In that
okay.
same way, Jesus being the Son of God is intended as a symbolic methodology by which to ascribe or describe certain conditions of the relationship between God
Right.
and Jesus.
Okay, fair enough. I'm just going to decompose this. Like, is this is God's son is Jesus thing to what you actually mean by it?
Sure.
So can you explain in particular what the attribute, like what is the relationship exactly between God and Jesus?
Yeah, so the best way and the most succinct way to describe it would be that Jesus is God embodied in human form. And so Jesus is God come down to the level of human to better interact with human existence.
Okay, so Jesus is God.
Yes. It's this is where we would get into like the really muddy waters of Trinity doctrine, which I'm not even necessarily totally certain that I believe in, but for the sake of what I currently believe, Jesus is in fact both God and separate from God.
Hmm.
Which like we don't I get it. Yeah, religious language, religious stuff, it pretty much is the case that it's not really cohesive or it's what's that? It's non-cognitive, right? I get it. I'm not necessarily making that as a truth claim. We're just talking about this in the context of like what would necessitate it being true in probabilities.
Okay.
Because it would be statistically, or it would be probabilistically impossible for something to simultaneously be something and not be something. That's why I'm saying that.
Sure. Okay, let's see. Okay. So far we have God is Jesus. God is able to assume a human form. God created everything. God corporeally, like in his form as Jesus, quote unquote, died for the sins of mankind. And God, in the form of Jesus, is the only source of salvation. Correct?
How many claims is that so far? I know I have to stay under 28.
Yeah. So far we have 5. We'll
Cool.
see
I'm doing
this.
pretty well.
Yeah, we're doing okay so far. Um, so let's see here. God is able to assume a human form. God created everything. Interesting. God created everything. Now, the thing about creating everything, that seems like it's a composite claim of a very large number of claims.
I don't necessarily think that that's the case. If we look at the language specifically used in the creation narrative, it doesn't actually give us an outline of what it is being claimed that God created. So it could be that God created one particular instance in time
Mhm.
that then caused further the existence of all other things to come into being. So it's only by proxy or ancestry, uh, ancestry. Almost sounded like I said ancestry, which would just be fucking weird. Ancestry that we actually would make the claim that God created everything. Because it's not as if God came down or God like directly interacted through a human being to invent like concrete. But concrete wouldn't exist without that one original movement, that one original action that would have solicited all of creation. So to say that God created everything isn't to say that God is responsible for the individual creation of all things that occur within a system. It's to say that God created the one instance under which the system that would create all of these things, that's what God created. So it really only requires one thing for God to have created everything.
Right. Now, if you create an entire universe in like a one instance of time worth of an entire universe, that does seem to me to be a complex claim. That seems to me to be, I created this tree and I created this rock and I created this other planet and I created these photons of light and I also created this particular atom of iron and so on and so forth. Like, I'm not saying that necessarily the Christian claim is as detailed as all that, but it's at least as detailed as claiming that God created um, something that leads to um, the Earth as we know it. Like, I just want to, how detailed is that instant in your
Yeah,
understanding?
so I think that you could really go either way on it. You could argue that it's incredibly complex or that it's incredibly simple. I mean, like, it could be as complex as, say, starting a car, where like you have to turn a key and then the electronic signal has to go through the alternator, and then the alternator needs to turn over to incur or to make the starter move, and then the starter starts sending sparks, and then the sparks move, and then the cylinders start to pump, and blah 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 blah. Right? It could be that that's the case. It could also be that the inception of the entire universe was as simple as the input of one particular kind of molecule into a particular kind of space, and then everything from there was then set forth in motion. Like we can't figure out how simple or complex those conditions would need to be. I would lean towards them being simple because of
Mm.
the principle of Occam's razor. Well, that what is most simple is most likely. So I would say that if we were to just ultimately reduce things down and down and down and down and down until we got to the point of original inception, it's likely that that particular thing is this profoundly and hilariously simplistic process by which everything else came into being.
Um, yeah, yeah, I think that makes sense. Let's see. So when you say God is Jesus, you do say that God, you know, in his corporeal form, died for the sins of mankind, and is a source of salvation. Now, of course, only source of salvation is actually kind of two separate claims. It's the claim that he is a source of salvation,
He is the only source of salvation. That's fair.
and that nothing else is. Um,
When I'm referring to salvation, I am referring to a very specific process that is not necessarily like proven biblically, as far as I view it. Right? Salvation being like admittance into a specific kind of heaven, not like salvation as in like if I don't have it, I'm going to hell. Because like I don't think that there is necessarily a full-on doctrinal support of the idea of hell. And that a lot of the ideas of hell are misinterpreted. So it's not that there is no purpose in other religions or that there is no enlightenment to be found in other religious structures. It is simply that the only way through which you gain admittance into heaven is through Jesus. And that does sound fickle, and I know that. But it's what I hold. I
Interesting.
apologize.
So can you explain to me? So you say, okay, so real quick again, what is salvation?
So
That
I
which
would say
allows you
that
admittance into heaven?
yeah.
Okay. Uh,
But I wouldn't count
so
that as an independent claim because salvation is usually referred, or usually in religious language, is referring to the idea of admittance into their afterlife. So, like, I achieve salvation in Mormonism, and I get to do all the things that are outlined in the Book of Mormon as what their afterlife is. Same thing with like Islam and all the other world religions. Salvation is referring specifically to the most positive version of their afterlife.
yes. One sec. Yeah, here we go. I'm just gonna run down a list just to make sure we're not missing anything here.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, mm, would you say that a god can be the Christian God if it is utterly evil?
So actually, there's a philosopher who does talk about this. You've probably Kierkegaard.
Mhm.
So in Kierkegaard's essay book, Fear and Trembling, he basically outlines the conditions under which God could be viewed as being evil and still be God. It's called a teleological suspension of morality, I believe. And basically, what it says is that it's not necessary that God is able to be ascribed with the characteristics of any particular human kind of morality. It is necessary that God can be ascribed the characteristics of having a God kind of morality. So, God is only moral in the sense that he's moral to God, not in the sense that he's moral to humanity. And I, in fact, would even make the claim that human morality is something explicitly created by humans and is arguably the first sin observed, quote unquote, observed by God in the narrative. So when it is said that God finds Adam and Eve after, which this is not referring to something literal. I'm using the language of metaphor and storytelling to try and exhibit my point. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that this literally happened. So when God finds Adam and Eve in the garden after they've eaten of the fruit, they've decided to clothe themselves. And God says, "Who is it that told you that you were naked?" As if to say, under what conditions were you able to ascribe the badness of a particular state of being or the wrongness or evilness of a particular state of being? And they say, well, we just like we didn't we told ourselves that is their response basically. And so that is, in my opinion, the first example of any kind of human morality, and it is clearly abhorred by God because it's the thing that indicates that they are no longer operating in oneness with God. They are operating separately from. So to say that God must be good under the conditions of human good doesn't follow because it's clear that God finds those conditions to be pretty much irrelevant.
Okay. Would you Sorry, was that a claim? God finds human morality irrelevant? Just
If you want
checking.
to nitpick, sure, it could be a claim.
Well, is
As
it
long
though?
as
I
I'm
don't
under
want
28, I feel like I have a reasonable argument here. So you can add as many as you want up to that point.
to. Wait, no, but if I get up to 27 and then I'm like, okay, we got the 28th, and then you like go back through the list, you're like, wait, I don't agree with that one. Like, I want to make sure you agree with them
No, no,
as we
no.
go. So.
Right. But I'm gonna be much more generous between now and then. Right. Once we start getting to the 20s, I'm just messing with
Okay,
you. No,
going forward.
I don't
Okay,
think that that's necessarily a claim, but I would say sure, we could view it as a claim, and I would be okay with viewing it as a claim.
based. Okay. God doesn't care, or would it be fair to say that God isn't bound by human morality?
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that God is bound by his own morality?
That would imply that there exists a morality for God, and I don't think the conditions for morality are met by the conditions of God's existence. So the conditions of what is defined as morality for us are like a group or a set of actions that could determine whether or not something is favorable or unfavorable. And it is the case that God always acts in the favorable way. So it is impossible for there to be a juxtaposition by which we would be able to make the claim that he acts in not that way.
Sorry, does good come from God, or is God good because there's some existing standard for good and God meets it?
Uh, yes, a Euthyphro. I'm familiar.
Yeah.
um, so I don't think that that is necessarily the proper way in which we ought to look at things. Because when we're looking at what it is that God, quote unquote, commands us to do, we are looking at it with the weightedness of morality, because morality is something that we as humans ascribe to actions. God's not ascribing a morality to an action. He's ascribing
Ah,
a result to an action. So
oh,
it is the case that what is told for us or what is commanded of us is in some way, whether known to us or not, the most prosperous way by which things ought to be done, not the most good way. And we can ascribe a morality to it afterwards. That's totally fine. But it is not the case that God is attempting to ascribe what is good or what is not good. He's using the linguistic functions of social interactions in an attempt to persuade individuals to follow those particular kinds of rules, knowing that they will, in fact, solicit the most prosperous outcome.
damn. So like God is like a moral non-cognitivist? Is that
And God doesn't have morality, homie.
damn. God's just going around persuading people. Okay. So you're saying God is amoral. God does not have morality.
No.
What you just said, God doesn't have morality.
Sorry. Yes, I'm agreeing. God does not have morality.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I was
Okay, okay,
agreeing
well,
with the
cool.
statement. No, he does
Cool, cool,
not.
cool, cool.
Sorry. My bad.
Yep, yeah, understood. Okay, God doesn't have morality, isn't bound by human morality. Well, one implies the other, those aren't independent anymore. God does not have morality. Uh, this is gonna be a journey. Um,
Wasn't our last debate 2 hours?
yeah, something like that.
It was wonderful. I've re-listened to it twice.
Oh my God. Okay,
You have a
based.
very nice voice.
Oh, thank you. And this time I even have a nice mic, so it'll be even nicer.
Oh
I don't think
damn.
I don't think I was using it last time.
I'm
The
using
recording
not
looks
as nice
even.
of a mic. I'm guessing I sound not as good.
You sound fine. I don't know how nice I sound. Um, Okie dokie. So God is Jesus. Jesus did stuff. You're not claiming that God did all the stuff that it said Jesus did, correct?
Well, I mean, if God is Jesus, then yeah, that'd be necessary. But I think that because God is Jesus, that like those don't become independent claims. It's just like God, Jesus is God, God is Jesus. That's one claim. It would
No, no,
follow
no.
necessarily that
Yeah.
if
No,
Jesus
no,
did
no.
things, God.
Right, right. I mean, specifically, are you claiming God, no, Jesus, like God rose from the dead after he was crucified, for example, or God sat around with his fisherman hombres and counted 153 fish or whatever,
500 fish. Thank you very much.
if
I'm
you
just
say
kidding.
so.
Um, maybe it was 1,000. That story actually happens 2 separate times, where they feed a bunch of fish to people and a bunch of bread to people. If I'm remembering correctly, it's 2 different instances under which Jesus did that. This is where we're going to get to the non-cognitivist part of the argument, where I basically will say that like God is Jesus, Jesus is God, but Jesus is also not entirely God, because the conditions of God's existence imply that it is separate from humanness. So as soon as it is ascribed humanness, it is not entirely God. So it is not the case that God did everything exactly that Jesus did, but it is the case that God did everything exactly that Jesus did, but only in part. But again,
Are-
this is non-logical, and I know that, and there's really no way for me to rationally prove that. But these are the conditions of the faith, right? The point at which logic is no longer present is where faith is going to have to come into it, or choosing to believe is going to have to come into it. So I can't prove logically that it is the case that like God died for a moment and like
Hey, don't
the
worry about it.
universe was absent of God for 3 days. Like I can't prove
Wait,
that. I wouldn't even
you
claim
don't
that.
you don't have to. You don't have to. You're
Yeah.
not defending the claim that it's likely. You're just defending the claim that it's not super fucking unlikely. So if we get anywhere close to 50% probability, you're chill. Um, so wait, did I hear you say that when w- if something is human, then it's not God? Like, so if we have Jesus doing something that's human-like, then that's not God doing it, or something like that. What was that?
So what I'm saying is that like so Jesus is God. God is Jesus, right? But one of the conditions of the existence of God would be that it is intrinsically separate from the conditions of its existence. So much so that if it were to adopt the conditions of that existence, it would no longer be entirely God. So Jesus is not entirely God or not entirely human.
Right, of course. Okay. God is okay, so okay, correct me. So this
So
seems
we
like
can
it's
add a
splitting
claim
into
to say
2
that
claims, yeah.
yeah, I would
It's
say that we
yeah.
could add a claim to say that God is intrinsically separate from, if you want to add a
So,
claim,
I mean,
because
I
I
would
feel like
just
there's a lot of
we can just go with God is somewhat Jesus and God is not entirely Jesus. Does that work?
sure.
Yeah.
Again, I know this isn't logical. I apologize to those of you in the audience who are expecting that.
That's chill. It's fine if you say he's sorta Jesus, but not entirely Jesus. That doesn't seem contradictory to me. Um, Now let's see. But correct me if I'm wrong, but so like Jesus, Gospel of John,
Mhm.
miraculous catch of 153 fish on the third appearance of Jesus after his resurrection. Okay. This is, John 21, 1 to 14. Um,
That's after his resurrection. I'm pretty
that's
sure
right.
that the miraculous catch of fish is when Jesus walks onto the dock and tells Peter to cast his net on the other side of the boat. And when they pull it up, there's a shit ton of fish in there. And then Peter
Well,
chooses to go and follow Jesus after that.
well, it's after. I mean, it's after Jesus' resurrection. So I'm looking
Okay, so
at
there's
Wikipedia
there's
right now.
parallelism. That's okay. Yeah, you're good. I was just making sure I was verifying the correct story.
Yeah. So I guess I just want to know, do you would it be Jesus if Jesus was never resurrected? Is that intrinsic to your concept of Jesus or not?
Mm, okay. My personal concept, yes.
Based.
The general Christian concept, not necessarily. There's an anecdotal story that I heard from a pastor who was a pastor in Australia, where the government came to them, like a state government came to them and said, "Hey, we'll let you run this event, but you have to work with this other Christian school, and you have to agree on it completely. You have to agree on what's going to be taught there completely. And if you can do that, then we'll let you run the event." And when the two of these two different schools get together, one of them says, "Well, Jesus was only resurrected metaphorically or in spirit," and the other one says, "Well, Jesus was only, or was it no? Jesus was resurrected in bodily form." And so the anecdote is that they don't end up being able to agree with each other, and because they can't come to an agreement, they don't get to like have this opportunity to run this event that both of those organizations really wanted to run. So it is not the case that he has to be like in bodily form resurrected in order for the conditions of Christianity to be met. Now, if we're talking about my personal conditions, I do believe that that is the case. But if it
How
weren't
about
the case, it would not undermine my faith completely.
How about resurrected in any sense whatsoever?
Well, but I mean, like resurrected in any sense whatsoever could be like resurrected in the sense of
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Like, sure. I mean, I don't necessarily think that that is like I don't think that's a good sound claim to make because like I could say I metaphorically resurrected Frodo because I imagined him in my mind after watching Lord of the Rings. Like, I don't
Fine.
think that that's a good claim. You know, I
I
think
don't have
that
I don't have an issue with that.
yeah.
You can go right ahead and make that kind of vague claim. That's fine. So you agree like that if Jesus was not resurrected in any form whatsoever, it would not be Jesus?
Wait, say that one more time.
If Jesus wasn't resurrected in any form whatsoever, even like in the most like you know metaphorical way,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
it would not be Jesus. This person just wouldn't
Well,
be
I mean,
Jesus.
the conditions of that of the narrative, the conditions of the things that would be necessary for him to be Jesus, yeah, it would include that he was resurrected in some capacity.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Okay. So um,
I didn't quite understand what it was that you were saying, so I do apologize if we were beating around the bush there for a second.
okay. So God was resurrected in some capacity as Jesus. Um,
So, what are our claims so far that you've outlined?
one, God is somewhat Jesus. Two, God is not entirely Jesus. Three, God is able to assume a human form. Four, God created everything. Five, God corporeally died for the sins of mankind. Six, God is able to give you the key to heaven. This is just my way of saying like the salvation thing. Seven, nothing else besides God is a source of salvation. Eight, God does not have morality. And nine, God was resurrected in some capacity as Jesus.
Yeah, so I would combine the two about the keys to heaven and salvation into one particular claim. I don't think that you can separate those out as different claims. I think that we would need it. It would be the case that if you have the keys to heaven, quote unquote, then you have salvation. So I don't think
No,
that those are separate claims.
no. Like, so I didn't say like God gives you the key to salvation. God gives you the key to heaven, and God gives you salvation separately. The one claim is God is able to give you salvation, and the other claim is nothing else can give you salvation. Right? They're the two parts of
I
God
guess,
is the only thing that can give you salvation.
sure. I mean, if you want to separate those out, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I think so. Um,
I felt as if like when we started outlining these claims, we had already assumed that there was a God that existed. So that's part of why I had said that, like, or why I would say that I think that it's unreasonable to say that like God can give salvation is a part of the claim. But I guess I understand from your perspective, we're not doing as if God absolutely exists. We're operating from if God doesn't exist, which would mean one of the claims would have to be that God can grant salvation in some capacity.
Well, it's more like what is the definition of God? If you think that like all these other things were true about some being, but it wasn't able to grant salvation, would you consider that God? And if the answer is no, that's necessary for something to be considered God, then it's part of the definition and it's part of the claim that God exists,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I guess I'll stick with it then.
Yeah, we're only on
There is
9. Don't worry about it.
no, I mean, just there's a part of me that like, not that I want to nitpick every particular claim, right? I didn't realize that I had made that claim, which is why I'm talking about it. Um,
Oh,
part of the reason that I'm thinking about this is that I'm not entirely sure that it is necessary that the condition or that salvation or heaven, right, is the right way in which to phrase it. But I'm really not finding any particular way that sounds or that is sound to argue around that idea to say that it is not the case, or that if that was not the case, it would still be God in the Christian sense. Like that's just not possible. It is necessary that it grants salvation. Yeah.
paste. Um, got my dual monitors set up here, boys. Um, do we have anything conjunctive here? Uh, well, let's see. It's possible for God to be resurrected in a capacity that is not. It would be possible for a being to be resurrected without. No, that's just a qualifier. That's not a separate claim, is it? Hmm. No.
If we're talking about the realm of like what is possible, then we may as well just say that it is almost certain that no God exists based off of our
No, no,
perception
no,
of
no,
possible.
no, no. So,
Right?
but when
Yeah.
I say these possible things, I'm talking about like I'm just trying to make sure that I don't have any claims that are dependent on one another, because otherwise they wouldn't affect the probability in the same way. So,
Right.
and similarly, I want to make sure that like I don't have one single claim that is actually multiple independent claims. So if there's
Yeah.
like one statement that kind of says two things, I want to make sure I kind of split those up. But
Right. Which is why you
I'm
split up the claim about salvation, right? So,
yeah,
yeah. I understand exactly what you're saying when it comes to like you don't want claims that rely on each other because when one claim relies on the previous claim, the statistical probability of that thing happening increases substantially.
well, it's no, no,
Because
no. It's more like so if we say if I have two claims that I've listed here, right? And one of
Mhm.
them implies the other, then the thing that is implied by the other claim doesn't decrease the probability, the prior probability. It doesn't contribute to the complexity, because if the first thing is true, the second thing is true. So it's not like it's
You're
not
talking
a
about
separate
conclusions
fact.
versus outcomes.
Sorry?
You're talking about conclusions versus outcomes. So like you're not saying that like what are the chances that I get heads, heads, tails, heads, heads. You're saying that like it is the case that I will get heads, heads, tails, heads, heads because I've concluded that I've gotten heads, heads, tails previously or something like that, right?
It's kind of like this. So if you say um my claim is that I will get heads and then tails. Um, or if you say that, like you say, like, okay, I'm gonna flip my coin a million times, right? And you claim one of these times it's gonna be heads. Um, I don't get to say like, wait, that doesn't quite imply. If I say no, if I say this, I'm going to flip a coin. That's the first claim. The second claim is I am going to flip something. Okay. If I say I'm going to flip a coin and I'm going to flip something, this isn't like a more complex claim than I'm going to flip a coin, right?
Right.
Like adding in
Like,
I'm going to flip something is already contained in the complexity of the first clause of the sentence, so it doesn't
right.
increase the complexity at all.
Right.
No. Anyway, um, would it be God? Would God be God? Would a being be could it be that a being was God if they were mortal? As in they had like a lifespan of like 100 years?
See, and this is the point at which I guess like so you specifically said the Christian God, right?
Yeah, I mean the
Under that
Christian God.
assumption, I assumed that we weren't going to go through all of the claims of what would make God God. There are, if you want to talk about whether or not a God is most likely to be existent,
No, no, no.
probabilistic,
Wait,
I don't think that is the case.
here's the thing. Here's the thing, right? So I'm when I say Christian God, that's helping your argument, right? Because or wait, no, it's hurting. Like when I say Christian God, that hurts your argument. Like if we were talking, if I was going to broaden it to God in general, that would be good for you because it's a vaguer claim, so it's more likely to be true. The Christian God adds in more complexity to the claim, so like we don't want to go there. It's I would want to go there. Um that would help my argument to or God damn it, it would help your argument, I guess, is the point. You don't have to worry about me broadening it to a general God. That's good for you if we do that. Is what I mean to say.
Right. Sure. I think the reason that I'm bringing this up, or the reason that I'm stating this, is because like ultimately my thought in the way that I approached the prompt was that well, if I just omit the need to prove the existence of a god and only need to prove the existence of one particular
Okay.
version of
Okay. Here's
God,
what I understand you to be saying then. Your proposition here is what is the probability of the Christian God given that there is a God, right?
yes,
Okay.
yes,
So my proposition is what is the probability of the Christian God? Full stop. There's no I don't assume that a God exists.
okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, if that is the case, then I would say that if we're looking at this through like a strictly probabilistic lens, and we are going to be outlining a bunch of different conditions under which God would exist, then it is the case that it's just going to be so exponentially unlikely that there's almost no reason for me to even argue that it might potentially be the case. The only argument that I think I might be able to make that would be cogent as far as whether or not a God exists in the first place would be to say that if we were to look at all of the things that go into the inception of an entire universe and the ability for even one particular tiny little instance to occur that would have solicited that universe being brought into existence, or the infinite number of universes being brought into existence, the complexity of things that would have needed to occur happenstantially at any given moment in a succinct way is so much more exponentially unlikely than it would be if there were some sort of prime mover that simply did that
Yeah.
thing that brought all of those other things into existence. And again, by Occam's razor, we would say that which is most simple is most likely. So it would be most likely that if it is infinitely and nearly impossible for all of the proper things to occur within a specific instance of time in order to solicit all of the things that would exist into perpetuity, if that's statistically almost completely impossible, then the simpler answer would be to say that it was an intended thing, an intended action done by some sort of force. And then that force
Yeah,
represents
yeah.
only
We'll get
one
into
condition.
we'll get into the evidence for God at a later date, but just for now, we're talking about just the prior probability, right? But like there's you have to get both, otherwise we can't talk about how likely it is. But I just want to clarify something. You did just
Mhm.
say that you think the probability of a God in general existing is very low, right?
Well, I mean, I think that, look, if so, in the way that the Bible outlines belief, if it were the case that the probability were actually incredibly high, then I think
Wait,
it would violate the terms of God's existence, because part of God's existence is that it's unprovable. So if I can, through the principles of human faculties, attempt to prove that something exists, then it undermines the existence of God, because he said that he's not provable. But for you to say that is almost certainly non-existent based off of a probabilistic claim, right? When I saw the word Christian, I specifically thought to myself, well, it doesn't make any sense for you to say that the Christian God is the one that's most probabilistically unlikely, because the conditions under which the Christian God can exist are substantially lower than the conditions necessary for other gods to exist.
I see what you're saying. You're saying, right. So what I'm hearing is like if you assume that some God exists, then this Christian God is much simpler than than a lot of the other gods. So it's not going to be the most unlikely, right?
Right.
If we're just selecting among the gods, this one's pretty good. This one's pretty simple, right?
Pretty solid.
But
Yeah.
right. Yeah, but I'm not doing that. Like I'm not assuming that a god exists, right?
Sure.
Okay. So, but I just want to be clear. Like, I understand that that was your view of the proposition. But I'm just going to ask you independently. Do you believe that it is like highly unlikely for any god to exist without
If I'm
specifying
operating
which?
from a strict position of probability, from a strict position of where it is that you're coming from, then I would
Well, I,
say
well, I'm just
it's
asking you. Do you think it's unlikely? Right. That's all. I'm not asking you anything else. I'm just asking. So, of course, it's going to be from the perspective of probability. Yeah.
okay. So from for me personally, I would say that I think that it is more likely that there is a God than it is less likely that there is a God. But I understand that that's a personal claim. I don't think that that's a global claim or a probability claim. I think it's a personal claim.
Okay, so perhaps we mean different things when we say likely. To me, likely is just synonymous with probable. So let me rephrase. Do you think it is highly improbable for any god to exist? Because I
I
believe
feel
I
like the
heard you say
answer.
those
I feel
words,
like the
but
answer for me is still no. I mean, I
okay.
think that there are factors that we can look at, but those factors require a certain kind of faith. I don't think that there's a way that we can. I don't think that there's a way that we can take that which is empirically known and things that are even like logically justifiable and say if we lay all of these out, the conclusion is going to be that it is probable that a God exists. I don't think that we can do that. But I don't
Wait,
think that that's the point of God.
I,
I think
I
that
didn't.
if I were to lay out faith claims in conjunction with all those other claims, then I would come to the conclusion and say, well, it is likely that some sort of force exists in the universe that does certain things and meets certain conditions, and I am going to choose to ascribe those or that force to the characteristics of the Judeo-Christian God.
Okay, so I think we're a little confused here. So I was what I just heard you say is that if we take various, empirical axioms and logical axioms and so on, like we can't go from there to say that God exists, or that it's probable that God exists. But my question is not, is it probable for God to exist? My question is it highly improbable, highly unlikely, highly improbable for God to exist?
I feel like I answered the question, so I apologize.
Hmm.
What part of my statement doesn't answer that question?
Well, my understanding is that you said that you don't think it's probable that God exists, which doesn't answer my question.
You're right. Do I think that it is improbable for God to exist?
Yeah,
I I
highly.
think that it is right. I think that it is probable for God to exist. But
Okay.
again,
You think it is
I
probable for God to exist.
right, but again, I don't think that those are claims that would I don't think those claims would meet the criteria of what could be considered a cogent probabilistic claim.
That's fine.
I'm
That's
talking
fine.
about
I was just trying to
yeah.
make sure because it sounded like you were saying that like I think that it's highly improbable for God for any God to exist. And I was like, well, okay, well we can end the argument quickly. But okay, if you do believe that God is probable, then we have to proceed.
Yeah,
Um
and I will say sometimes when I'm talking about God, I'm speaking from two different places, right? I'm speaking from the place of where I know my belief structure is going to end up ultimately missing the mark on being able to be proven in any kind of substantial or logical way through modal logic or any kind of proof, right? But I acknowledge that that is the case. So I don't want to make factual claims about that area that I know is in fact not factual. If I'm looking at what is factual, what is provable, what is able to be observed, what we consider to be logical and cogent, then it is unprobable that God exists because it
uh,
requires a function of faith to decide that it is probable that God exists. But if you're willing to grant that those claims that I make that include faith can provide some sort of probability influence, then I will gladly take that and say yes, it is probable. But
okay.
I'm operating from two separate places here where I'm saying, well, I know some of these beliefs aren't really real. They're just beliefs,
So
you
what I'm
know?
hearing you say, so I will give you a like a snapshot of the future after we hypothetically finish doing this lengthy prior probability calculation. If we then are talking about the evidence and you are giving me just like I have the evidence because I had this divine experience or like I have faith or something. Yeah, that's definitely not going to fly. So if that's what if you're saying that that's the only form of evidence that you have, we're going to have to say, well, we already have enough claims to assess that it's highly improbable for God to exist if we don't have any positive evidence for him.
Right. Well, I think that the function of believing in the Christian God specifically is contingent upon an abundance of faith. And I think that I know that's scripturally supported. So ultimately, no, I'm not going to be able to provide any evidence for God. And another part of this is that okay, so let's say what example serves as evidence for God, right? Because we have evidence to suggest that there was a figure that was like Jesus based off of Roman accounts. But we have no evidence to suggest that it was true that the Jews were enslaved or the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptian people. Even though the Egyptians kept fastidious historical records, there's no indication that that specific instance in time actually occurred. So I feel as if me making claims about oh well this thing happened that corresponds to scripture, or we found a thing that looks like Noah's Ark, or we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, those aren't substantial claims of evidence for God, probabilistically or metaphysically. They're not substantial. Ultimately, the function of believing in God, especially the Christian God, relies completely and entirely on faith explicitly. It does not rely on probabilities. But we're talking about objective probabilities about whether or not this is how I read the prompt, and I'm not necessarily trying to attack you. I'm defending the reason that I'm talking about this the way that I'm talking about this. So this has nothing to do with you being disingenuous or anything like that, and everything with me just wanting to affirm what the position from which I was approaching the conversation is that, you to say the Christian God specifically puts the conditions of the Christian God into the conversation of God. Because I don't think that you can say the Christian God doesn't exist in an effective manner unless you were to say it is unlikely that God is non-existent. I think that those are two separate claims. To say the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent, also God is almost certainly non-existent, right? Well,
Oh,
if God is non-existent, then the Christian God is non-existent. So there's no
that's
reason
true.
to specify the Christian God. You may as well just say God is almost certainly non-existent. But as soon
Well,
as you invoke a specific aspect of God, if you were to say the Islam God or the Muslim God, I can never remember which one is the proper way to refer to that. So if anybody knows in the chat, please let me know. But the Muslim God is almost certainly non-existent. Like, again, not really a great claim, because you would have to then go through the conditions of what defines the Muslim God, and you're eventually going to get to, well, what defines God? You can't really
right.
say that like one is all that different from the other. Ultimately, a lot of them are going to share in similar properties, especially if you're talking about Abrahamic faith. And if you're talking about like even some of the Eastern traditions, like even if they have a pantheon, there's still an existence of a kind of God. So like what kind of God are we proving exists? So to say that one specific kind doesn't exist just isn't a substantial claim. You'd have to go in, or without assuming that a God exists in the first place.
Um, no, I mean, so the Christian God exists is a proposition that is distinct from any God exists, and the relation between these claims is that the Christian God exists is implied by any God exists, or sorry, the other way around. Any God exists is implied by the Christian God exists, and not vice versa, right? And so the Christian God exists could be viewed as a claim such as any God exists, and here are some other additional claims about them, right? So the Christian God exists is necessarily less probable than any God exists, right? So it may be the case that the Christian God is highly improbable, but that any God is not highly improbable. Um, so to say that it's not a substantive claim without assuming that any God exists, no. I mean, I'm not concerned with whether or not rhetorically it sounds like I'm saying like it sounds to me like what you're saying is the fact that I've specified the Christian God made you think that I was saying is more unlikely than the other gods. But no, that's not my claim. I would have to have said the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent and the others aren't, or something. I didn't specify that second part of the claim. That would be much harder for me to defend. My claim is just the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent. In fact, I personally believe that the other gods are that many of the other gods, at least, are almost certainly non-existent as well. The Muslim God is almost certainly non-existent. There are other formulations of God that are so vague that they are probable. But that's not. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking specifically about the Christian God.
Sure, sure. Well, but then I think that I've kind of got an impossible mountain to climb here with this claim, because it is the case that proving simply that God exists in the first place is almost impossible. I mean, like I think it is impossible, in fact. The only way that we can do it is by the cheap shot of Occam's razor, in my opinion. I haven't heard another substantive claim that would make me believe that. So
Well,
not only do I have the mountain to climb to say that there is a God that exists, but I have added on to that mountain that I must prove that that God is the Christian God. And that adds or obfuscates even more my ability to actually prove the argument that it is that I'd like to make. Because it simply is the case that the number of complexities within that system is insurmountable. There's no way that I'm going to be able to get those conditions down to what, 5 or 10 even, in order for it to be satisfactory to the probabilistic function that you're operating from.
I'm glad we agree.
But
Okay.
I still
So
think that as the prompt is phrased, if we were to look at it like under whether or not the conditions or under the assumption that God does exist, then I do think that there is a reasonable discussion to be had there, that it is the case that the Christian God could in fact be the one that probabilistically exists. because we don't have to necessarily go into
Sure.
all the details or the nitty gritty of what that kind of God is unless we're going to start comparing all of these different versions or religions or kinds of gods.
Right,
And even then,
No,
reduce the
I
number of claims
mean,
because there's a lot of alignment between them. Like the Greeks think that gods are pretty much immortal. So did
yeah,
Christians.
yeah. If we have the definition of God and we assume that God exists, then we're not then all the constituent like atomic propositions that make up that claim are not going to contribute to the complexity of the specific like it specifically being the Christian God. That's absolutely the case. But yes, I agree that that would be an easier thing to argue. But it's like the idea of God existing is not at all presupposed by the proposition that we're debating here. So I can see how maybe like it's sort of I, I don't think it's really even implied that I am saying the Christian God is more likely non-existent than the other ones. The reason I chose the Christian God is just because I know that it is has a lot of additional complexity beyond just being a god, right? So I was like, okay, exactly as you've pointed out, you have to overcome that God exists, and then you also have to overcome that specifically all the things that are claimed about the Christian God are also true. And it's like, well, this is, as you say, very difficult to do, which is why I was pretty confident coming into this debate.
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of necessarily insurmountable unless you're willing to grant that through the use of Occam's razor, it is more likely that some sort of thing, a god, incepted all of creation. If you were willing to grant that, then maybe we could get into the conditions specifically of the Christian God, right? But I don't know that you're willing to grant that.
Well, I mean, I haven't been making a distinguishment between or a distinction, sorry, between the Christian God and the God claim in general. I've just been looking at both aspects of it, that it's a God and that it's the Christian God. I've just been thinking of them as the same thing. We've been talking about both of them.
Right.
But yeah, like I'm not I don't quite agree that it's completely insurmountable in the way that you're talking about. I think it's insurmountable for a number of good reasons. I think it's insurmountable because it's a highly complex claim and because there's no good evidence for it. And so I would just say I agree with you that it's not defensible, but that's not because it's some kind of tautology. It's because the particular claim in question is very complex, and the particular content of the claim isn't really supportable when you look at reality. So, yeah, I mean, I think that your statements are probably going to serve as a good closing statement for me. So why don't you go ahead?
So basically, what you're saying is I can argue for my interlocutor, but you can't argue for yours.
Wait, what do you mean? What?
It's
Oh yeah,
fine. It's fine.
yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, well, no, I mean you don't have to, but yeah, by all means, go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess my closing statement would be that I mean, if it is the case that we're operating from the assumption that no God exists, then it
No,
would be the
you're
case
not. No, 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 no. No. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt your closing statement. I do
that. Go ahead.
apologize for that. Okay.
I
So
down
if
from the
we
soapbox.
assume if we assume that no God exists, then it follows that the Christian God does not exist, and this would be tautological, and this would be bad faith of me to come in here and say I'm assuming that no God exists. Let's argue about whether or not the Christian God in particular exists, but that's not my claim. I am not assuming one way or another whether or not any God exists. I'm just in particular wondering whether or not this particular God exists. It may be that the Christian God exists, in which case there is one God at least that exists. So I just want to make sure we're not. I'm not at any point assuming that there is no God.
Sure, sure. I think that to operate from the place of not assuming that there is a God or is not a God, I'm not trying to claim that you're being disingenuous by any means. I'm just saying that if we operate from the place of assuming or even not having an assumption about God, then we have one claim to overcome, which would be that God, in fact, exists. That claim in itself is nearly insurmountable probabilistically, according to pretty much every metric of measurement that we have afforded to us. Now, if we were to, in addition, add the conditions of a specific type of God, now we have to both overcome the existence of one particular God or of any kind of God, and then add into that the conditions of another kind of God. And if we know the functions of probability, then we would know that that increases the complexity of the claim and would therefore decrease the probability to a point at which we could say almost certainly it is not the case that this is the thing. But if we were to operate from the place of assuming that there was a God, and we only had to prove that the characteristics of that God were that of the Christian God, I believe that there is enough substantive evidence that would align with a better theology that would explicitly say or be able to substantially conclude that it is just as likely for the Christian God to exist as any other God to exist, and therefore we would not be able to say that the Christian God is almost certainly non-existent. But under the conditions of what Azgerod has said throughout the argument, it was the case that we kind of had to start from scratch and without any kind of assumptions. And if that is the case, I think that it is an insurmountable task to actually prove the existence of any kind of specific God without first assuming that a God exists.
Okay, couldn't have said it better myself.